This is World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. Today, a special program featuring some of the most prominent figures who try to build bridges between China and the U.S. amid challenges to bilateral relations. Now let's meet Stephen Roach, a senior fellow at Yale University's Jackson Institute for Global Affairs. He's vocal about his views on what's troubling U.S. China relations. In my most recent interview with him, Roach argued the U.S. must deal with its trade deficits not by picking fights with others, but by cultivating more equal opportunities from within. Professor Roach, what a pleasure to see you once again in Beijing.
Great to see you too.
Great to see you. You got some very convincing statistics for us, illustrating the U.S. trade deficit, how it was formed, what's the reality. One thing you talk about is how many countries the U.S. has trade deficit with. Tell us more about that.
Well, we have a multilateral trade problem, which means we have deficits with many, many countries. And it comes from our shortfall of savings. When countries don't save, and America doesn't save, and you want to grow, you import surplus savings from abroad, and you run a big current account deficit to attract the capital. And that gives rise to this multilateral trade imbalance. Yeah. We had trade deficits last year, for example, with 102 countries, ranging from
China, which is the biggest one.
Which is by far the biggest, Germany, Japan, Mexico, all the way down to small places, believe it or not, the Vatican. We run trade deficits with over half the countries in the world.
I wonder what Vatican exported to the United States.
Well, I joke when I talk about the Vatican. I'd say it's part of our spiritual deficit. But it's not a particularly big item, but yeah, it's just indicative of the fact that our trade deficits are pervasive. And it's a multilateral problem, and the problem with U.S. trade policy right now is we're trying to find a bilateral fix for a multilateral problem, and it won't work. Because if we don't adjust the saving rate upward, if we go after one trading partner, like China, with a bilateral fix, the Chinese piece will be spread to other countries who are higher cost producers, and that will be the equivalent of a tax hike on American consumers. So it's a losing proposition.
But how to solve that problem? That is a big problem for a long time.
The main factor holding back our saving, believe it or not, is our big budget deficits. So in 2017, at the end of the year, the Congress and the Trump administration pushed through a gigantic tax cut, which is lowering our savings rate even more, which will create bigger problems for our trade deficits, not just with China, but with the other 101 countries as well.
But they're arguing that's exactly why the economy is doing so well right now in the United States.
Well, it did well for a while, but as we say, the bloom is off the rose. I mean, the growth rate has decelerated for 4 consecutive quarters in a row. It was 4% in the second quarter of 2018, fell to 3 in the third quarter, 2 in the fourth, and 1 in the quarter that's now ending. So, it was what we call a sugar high. It felt good. It was very sweet while we ingested it, but the taste is worn off, and the economy's gone back to its pre-tax cut sluggishness.
Right. So you think there has to be an overall rethinking of the U.S. economic policies to begin with. But Professor, that's not going to happen, right?
I think, as we move through this period of challenging political leadership, challenging economic leadership, we have an adaptable, flexible, resilient system. And I think, I'm hopeful that, if we do get a shift in leadership, that there'll be a rethinking of economic policy that will go along with that.
That's the other thing, that there are people pin all the problems to Trump himself, as if a change of person in the White House will solve all the problems. And that's not true, because the trade deficit thing the budget problem has been there for a long time.
That's
the
very
saving
true. That's
issue
very
is
true.
a tradition of American consumers.
Well, but let's hold on a second. Let's check
Professor,
that with data.
Go ahead.
In the final 3 decades of the 20th century, our domestic savings rate, adjusted for depreciation, which you should do to measure it correctly, averaged 6.5%. Today, the number is about 3. So we're operating at less than half the longer-term historic average. So there's been a big shift down recently, reflecting reckless fiscal policy. If we can address that and at least get back to the norm in the final 3 decades of the 20th century, that will make a difference. It won't solve the problem. You're entirely right. But it'll make a difference in an otherwise very difficult problem.
What are the other things that would make a difference in terms of reducing the U.S. trade deficit?
Certainly, if we are able to save more and plow back more of that saving into a rebuilding of infrastructure, manufacturing capacity, even human capital, then campaign slogans like Make America Great Again will also be grounded in more of a saving and investment support than we have today. It's hard to be competitive if you don't have the wherewithal to invest. And our lack of saving reflects, unfortunately, precisely that.
Last year, U.S. has already identified in 2 white papers that China as a strategic rival. Well, linking that with the many problems that you're talking about that the U.S. could change for the better, could that also be a momentum the U.S. administration could use very well to change its pattern of doing things for the decades and also be able to make the economy more efficient?
You ask a complicated question. I mean, our view of China as a strategic rival. Or strategic threat, whatever you want to call it, that is a strong geopolitical statement, and it has repercussions on China as well, because it certainly makes the Chinese feel as if America is very focused on containing its rise, and that's a serious concern in China. In the same sense, the United States feels that China aspires to capture new emerging industries, and America views that as an existential threat to its very future.
Right. The question really is, if there is a threat, whether that's true or not, if people perceived there is a threat, will that bring the strength together and get things done? That's my issue. Let's just put the Chinese issue aside.
I would prefer to say that we would rise to the occasion if there is a strategic challenge as opposed to a strategic threat. We're splitting words. You might say it means the same thing. I view it differently. I think that when there's a challenge, America has a long history of welcoming challenge and rising to the change.
Exactly.
All we want is an opportunity to compete fairly. And there's a big debate in America that, with respect to China, there's not reciprocal treatment. So we're not being given the fair shake that we've grown accustomed to. And that's debatable, I would say, to be quite frank. But I grant that that's a concern.
On the U.S. China front, finally we're reaching here. The negotiations are still going on, but the question is much more than the negotiation itself. It's only probably a step in the long road. So, Professor, as an economist, how do you see this uncertainty for the 2 economies, the largest economies in the world?
Uncertainty is the biggest enemy of business decision-making. When you're running a big company and you're thinking about the key decisions about expanding your capacity at home or hiring new workers or investing in a new product line, you hold back if you're uncertain about the future. And when there's questions that are going to be lingering long after this deal is done with China, that could have a major impact on your uncertain future, that's going to inhibit a lot of the key decisions that businesses need to make that would drive the economy. So it's a negative for economic prospects going forward.
Now, China tries to be proactive in terms of looking at the challenges between China and the United States. That's what the Chinese government believes. Whether this will be really seen as constructive from the other side, what do you think?
I think, with all due respect, the Chinese need to think out of the box a little bit, and Americans do too. I think.
What are the out-of-the-box things that you're talking about?
Okay, I mean, this new foreign investment law, it doesn't do it for me. It really doesn't. Let's start with a clean slate. What I would like to see is not, a lot of complex language about fair and reciprocal treatment, but agreement between two countries on a bilateral investment treaty. We've been trying to negotiate it for 10 years, and we got very, very close in the Obama administration, and we've given up. If you were able to complete successfully a bilateral investment treaty, you would eliminate all foreign ownership caps. You would eliminate the need to have joint ventures. That may make China uncomfortable, but that would take the issue of forced technology transfer, which is such a sticking point in this trade dispute, off the table, because there wouldn't be joint ventures and there wouldn't be any structure that would force it. And of course, this would have to be a compromise, so the U.S. would have to give on its side as well. And recently we passed an expanded oversight of our CFIUS Committee on Foreign Investment, which is very much aimed at China. And we have to back off on that too. Because if we want access to China, China deserves access to our markets as well. So let's stop solving this with complicated language that really doesn't achieve much at all, in my view.
But that's not likely to happen, is it? That's exactly the opposite direction that is happening right now.
Yeah, I've often been accused of being guilty of wishful thinking. But I just go back to the last 10 years of very serious and focused negotiation on trying to achieve agreement on a bilateral investment treaty. We got very close. It was a strong commitment of leaders from both countries. Why can't we recapture that spirit? You say it's not realistic. We were very, very close. So turn back the clock a little bit and try to come up with something that is truly workable, that takes one of the most contentious issues off the table. We can do that.
What tools, Professor Roach, do we have in mind to turn back the clock?
Well, that's a great question, and it's not magic. I mean, we do have certainly a leadership in the U.S. administration,
and that's only a part of the problem.
That is a manifestation of a problem that's been building for a number of years. I'd say the last 15 years.
Yeah.
This type of thing was waiting to happen. I wrote a book 4 or 5 years ago about the codependency of America and China, and I concluded by saying that this relationship where we both depend on each other so much is really unhealthy in the end.
Yeah.
If we don't fix our own problems from within, because when somebody gets destabilized, the other one reacts out of spite, and you have conflict, and we're living that conflict right now. So, the leadership issue, you're right, is only the latest twist in a problem that's been simmering for a long time.
Now,
but still, I think we can address many of these issues with a more enlightened leadership. And we have elections every 4 years. We have another one coming up in 2 years, and who knows, we may have a new, more enlightened leader.
But, Professor, there's always debate about the so-called Big Bang theory, which is to change the policies immediately overall as a whole, vis-a-vis the gradual approach theory. You see that debated at the end of the Cold War in some of the economies, particularly in Russia.
Sure.
You also see that in China over the past 40 years. So now, even China and the United States, about what approach to take for the two economies. That also applies here as well. So what do you think? Should that be a big bang, which you seem to suggest with the bilateral investment treaty?
I wouldn't call that a big bang. I mean, to me, a big bang is when you put your economy through a shock.
Yeah, right.
I'm not suggesting that we put either economy through a shock, although a trade war, if it gets out of hand, could be exactly that. So there's the longer we are stuck in a trade war, the greater the chance of escalation and an unexpected development, which could be a shock. The big bang I'm suggesting is just to do some sensible policy. But I don't want to shock therapy for any economy, China or the United States. That's not what the citizens of the people of either nation want or deserve.
Before we go, final question for you, Professor. I know you not only an economist, but also you studied history both of China and the U.S. very well. Are there some equivalent time in both countries' history that you think we can draw inspirations from or across?
There's a lot of lessons from history. There always are. We can learn from when things go wrong. You know, the 1930s, for example, was a time of great national trauma in the United States, a period of enormous instability.
Yes.
In China, and we know how far we went off the tracks and how we were able to pull ourselves up from the brink. We also know that from the standpoint of the United States, after the end of World War II, we were willing to sacrifice to rebuild our own economy after a war effort that took so much of our resources to fight. And we boosted our savings rate, we invested, we built infrastructure, we built a nationwide highway system, we focused on innovation, we were able to send a man to the moon. There were a lot of things that we didn't think we would be able to do, but we were able to put together a national resolve and a real commitment to do that. I think we can look back on those times as critical points in our own history. And I think with China, beginning in the late 70s under Deng Xiaoping, with reform and opening up, that was a spark that was lit that's still, lit a flame that's still burning today. And reforms, as they were the answer back then, are also the answer today for China. So there are a lot of just important periods that both nations can look to for help, inspiration, and guidance for the future.
Professor Roach, it's always a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.